That, Mr. Cooper.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. The motion before us arises from the very disturbing global news story by Sam Cooper of November 7th, which detailed that the Prime Minister and several members of the Cabinet have been briefed as early as January of this year by Canadian intelligence officials about a vast campaign of interference in our democracy by the Chinese Communist regime, including during the 2019 election campaign. Let me just say at the outset, but I want to be very clear that we are talking here about interference by the Chinese Communist regime. This has nothing to do with the people of China, with Chinese Canadians. It is specifically in regards to actions by the Chinese Communist regime, of which the Chinese people are victims of that totalitarian regime. Madam Chair, the briefings from CSIS are alarming in terms of the sophisticated campaign by the Chinese Communist regime to subvert Canadian democracy, including the funding of a clandestine network of at least 11 candidates through Chinese Communist intermediaries, corrupting political financing laws to advance the interests of the Chinese Communist regime, in placing agents in campaigns to direct, control, and influence candidates. The scope of the interference goes beyond that. It includes placing agents in MP offices to influence policy, corrupting Canadian officials to advance the interests of the Chinese Communist regime, and mounting an aggressive campaign to harass, intimidate, and politically undermine elected officials who the Chinese Communist regime believes who do not share or align with the interests of that regime. There are also some alarming revelations about the role that Chinese consulate offices in Canada are playing to interfere in our democracy and in our elections. For example, according to the briefs, the Chinese consulate in Toronto directed the funding of at least $250,000 to this clandestine network of candidates in which the funds were distributed through proxies of the Chinese Communist regime. It was also the Toronto consulate that directed a campaign worker to prevent a candidate from meeting with certain officials, including representatives from Taiwan. And beyond the 2019 election campaign, according to the briefings, the consulate in Toronto has been directing significant sums of money, potentially millions of dollars, to interfere in our democracy, including allegedly $1 million that was transferred from the Chinese Toronto consulate to proxy groups, which in turn organized protests in support of a continued partnership between the Toronto District School Board and the Chinese Communist regime's state-funded Confucius Institute. And the briefs further outline that President Xi's United Front operates through consulates in Canada from which officials direct funds into Canada's political system using Chinese Communist regime proxies. So these are very alarming reports, and given what the Prime Minister was evidently briefed on, this would demonstrate interference by the Chinese Communist regime in not one, but two consecutive federal elections, because we know of significant Chinese Communist interference in the 2021 election, interference that was detected by the Rapid Response Mechanism Canada of Global Affairs, which observed Communist Party media accounts on Chinese social media platforms spreading disinformation specifically targeted at conservative candidates. So, in the face of these very serious instances of interference by the Chinese Communist regime as part of what appears to be a very sophisticated campaign that involves intimidation of elected officials, involves corrupting former officials, involves corrupting elected officials, and involves an effort to influence the outcome of not one but two elections to serve the interests of the Chinese Communist regime. Canadians deserve answers. We need to get to the bottom of this interference. And it is disturbing that the Prime Minister was briefed about this, and members of his cabinet were briefed about this earlier this year in January, 10 months ago, perhaps sooner, and yet nothing appears to have been done on the part of the Prime Minister or on the part of the government. Despite evidence of interference by Chinese consulate officials, no one has been expelled from Canada. No one has been charged. There are no apparent investigations being undertaken. And there has been no action taken on the part of the government to respond legislatively, even though Canadian officials, former CSIS officials, or former ambassador to Canada, David Mulrooney, stated that Canada is more exposed than other Western democracies to Chinese communist interference. And so, in light of that, the motion before us is a straightforward one. Elections fall within the purview of PROC. We are undertaking a study on election interference, and given the alarming report, it is incumbent upon this committee, pursuant to our mandate, pursuant to the study that we are currently undertaking, to expand the study, to hold at least 4 hearings, so that we can hear from the appropriate agencies, to hear from ministers who may have been briefed, to hear from the current and former national security advisors of the Prime Minister from the time of the interference in the 2019 election campaign fruit of a time that the Prime Minister and members of his cabinet were briefed, and to hear from others, including former CSIS officials and our former Ambassador David Mulrooney, who can provide insight into our exposure, our vulnerabilities, and who are in a position to provide recommendations on how those vulnerabilities can be addressed, and to ensure going forward that our security, intelligence, and law enforcement agencies have all of the legal tools and all of the resources necessary to combat this kind of interference. This interference is simply intolerable. It is unacceptable. Canadians and Canadians alone ought to decide the outcome of elections free of foreign interference and free of this kind of corruption that is being advanced by the Chinese Communist regime, with witting and unwitting actors, according to the brief. So we need to know what the Prime Minister knew and why he has failed to act to address this interference. This motion is a starting point in that regard. Thank you, Madam Chair.